Hi, Alexander.
Good evening.
How are you today?
Pretty well and happy to participate in this interview.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, today my guest is Alexander Rinnooy Kan. He's distinguished professor at University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He was Rector magnificus of Erasmus University from 1986 to 1989, has published widely in professional journals, and holds a number of honorary degrees. As chairman of the Confederation of Netherlands Industry and Employers, a post he held from 1991 to 1996, Alexander was one of the main representatives of Dutch business. He was a member of the ING Group Executive Board from 1996 to 2006, and he has been chairman of the Netherlands Social and Economic Council from 2006 to 2012. In June 2015, he was elected to the Dutch Senate. He sits on a variety of boards and has advised the Dutch government on numerous occasions. According to the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant, Alexander was named the most influential person in the Netherlands from 2007 to 2009. Alexander, I can't thank you enough for accepting the invitation. It's such an honor.
My pleasure.
So let's start. Alexander, you have an unusual double surname, don't you?
I do, and a very confusing one. It frequently is written with an extra H after the K, but there's no connection at all to anything near that region. It so happened that my father's father, I should say, died when my father was still very young. His name was Kan, K-A-N. And when my grandmother remarried, and so my father had a stepfather whose last name was Rinnooy, at some point he decided to adopt that stepfather's name for himself as well, since that particular name was threatened to disappear after my grandmother only had a daughter from her second marriage. So my father had that double last name, which looks much more impressive than it is. There are only a few of us worldwide. It's very, very frequently misspelled and misinterpreted, but there it is. I can't do much about it, and I have learned to live with it.
Yes, but it kind of makes you unique too, right?
Maybe so. That's probably the one good thing you can say about it.
Yeah. So you mentioned one of your grandmothers. You had a Dutch grandmother and an English one. Both
Right.
of whom, according to your autobiography, were convinced social democrats. Could you briefly talk about them and the impact that they had on you?
They were both fantastic women, very independent in days that was not so common as it is today. Also very determined in their political opinion. My English grandmother turned it into a profession. She became a professional politician, ultimately got appointed to be mayor of one of the municipalities within London, Wandsworth, and being the first woman to do so, that attracted a lot of publicity. So when her daughter, my mother, married a Dutchman, it was pretty widely reported, and ever since then I had many conversations with her. She was very happy to explain to me how the world fitted together and had very strong opinions about that topic. And was very loyal to the Labour Party, even in days that many people turned away from that party because it radicalized and essentially estranged many people living in the UK at the time. My Dutch grandmother was Jewish, and she came from a family that was very active in the diamond industry. So that part of the Dutch industry was unionized in a very early phase. My grandmother also knew about it, met many of the now legendary leaders of that transformation, told me about it many times, and also remained a firm socialist until her last minute on earth. So she also was strongly convinced what kind of politics would be best for all of us. Neither of them were there when I, all of a sudden, and quite to my own surprise, became the chairman of the Employers Federation. I'm not entirely sure that they would have approved. And frankly, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't, but there you are. This is how it went. And I think, by the way, that the Netherlands has, at least when I was active in this particular interface, managed to create a culture where employers and trade unions interact very productively, and much more so than when my two grandmothers were active in the realm of politics. So I think I have an excuse, but I was well aware of the fact that they probably would have frowned upon this particular career step.
All right. I'm sure they would be proud of you for sure. What about your two grandfathers? Were they more quiet than your grandmothers?
Way, I think they were almost destined to be somewhat subdued compared to these extremely energetic and dominant women. Both of them were very nice men. My English grandfather had an interesting war career. He was active in MI5, not abroad, but in the UK. He never told me much about it, but I have to assume it was significant. And my Dutch grandfather was active in the world of pension and pension systems, quite prominent there. And in fact, he produced a very thick book that had the last information and final information on all the articles in the pension laws. And that was very frequently cited by experts as the ultimate source of wisdom. So he left his mark on this particular domain. But both of them, as you rightly surmised, were somewhat overshadowed by my very, very visible and active grandmothers.
I see. Your father was a lawyer and an ambitious person, while your mother sought harmony. Could you tell more about them and how this combination influenced you?
Ultimately, I think I benefited from both inputs. My father was very eager for me to succeed and rather pushed me in all sorts of new directions, was expecting great things. My mother was extremely harmonious, very afraid of conflicts, wary of conflicts, wanted to, essentially create a peaceful environment and encouraged me strongly to be a good listener and to make sure that people were properly treated and had proper attention, whatever their views might be. And so the combination of the two, I think, essentially turned me into who I am. And it worked extremely well for me. I remember them very fondly, both of them.
Mm-hmm. You have two younger brothers. Were they into math and politics like you?
No, quite the contrary. My oldest brother, younger than me, but the oldest of the two, at the end of his career, devoted almost all of his time to art. He was an extremely good painter. He did lots of things in between, especially in the world of communications. He had a great gift for language. He was a very, very successful artist, moved to the US to do his painting in the quiet and peace of the rural parts of upstate New York. And my younger brother, my youngest brother, so the youngest of the two, was a lawyer. Worked for ING for a while, but basically was a very good lawyer. And in fact, most of my family on both sides, mother and father, had activities closely related to law. So I'm really the exception in many ways.
Yes, very interesting. You played handball and swam when you were a kid, but did you or do you enjoy sports activities in general?
I see them as good for the body and also indirectly good for the soul. But I certainly am not a dedicated sports fan. I am sorry to disappoint you. I watched soccer in the 70s because the Dutch team was as good as it will ever be. And of course, I walk, I bicycle, as everybody does in the Netherlands. I try to keep active, but certainly primarily because I know it's good for me and not because I enjoy it disproportionately.
Right. What are your memories from the Dutch team from 1974, 1978?
Well, maybe the same as yours. We should have won the World Championship in 1974, but didn't. It's one of the great frustrations in the Netherlands. And many people still remember that disastrous match. And interestingly enough, in not so long ago, when I was walking through a public space where they showed the full report on this match, the television report, I stood there watching it, and I remember when the Netherlands took the lead in the very first minute and scored an opening goal out of a penalty after just, I think, 2 minutes. But of course, knowing what the ultimate outcome would be, I said to myself, I'll watch once more time and maybe this time they'll win. Because it was such an obvious opportunity. But of course, it didn't happen. So by and large, at the end of a long period of happy memories, this very frustrating one somewhat dominates.
Yes, I can imagine. I remember Martin Salversberg telling me that he kept a report on every match on that World Cup, but after the final, he couldn't complete his sort
No,
of diary.
no,
Yeah, it was really disappointing. Yes.
I sympathize.
Yeah. From your background, it's not hard to guess that you look like someone who appreciates classical music from a young age. Who are your favorite composers?
Oh, okay. These questions go everywhere except to mathematics, but here we go. I was especially influenced by my mother's preferences. She really taught me to enjoy music. And from that period alone, I have retained a lifelong fondness of especially two composers, Mozart and Brahms. But I've discovered many more since. And in fact, in recent years, I've certainly come to appreciate 20th century music much more than I ever did. I also discovered the Wagner operas, a class on their own. And although, again, you can say about Wagner what you want and dislike him as much as you want, but he was a terrific composer. So I do enjoy those. And in fact, I discovered recently that there are operas written in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the Shostakovich, the Benjamin Brittens, that I really enjoy and admire. So still learning.
Wow. So you still explore different
Absolutely.
forms of classical music to this day. That's incredible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Did you enjoy other musical genres as well, especially during the 60s and the 70s?
Of course, I was a teenager, so I wasn't listening to Mozart in those days. But of course, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones appeared on the scene and changed modern music forever and pop music forever. This is just an incredible legacy. So we were very lucky to be as old as we were when that happened. And I just looked at a picture of Mick Jagger, who is still alive and kicking. And I'm surprised how much he still looks like the person that we all admired so much in the 60s.
Yes. I wish I had the chance to live through that period. I'm a Beatles fan, so I can imagine how, exciting it should have been. Thanks to your very good preschool education, you started reading at a very young age and have estimated that you have read more than 10,000 books. What did you enjoy reading the most as a teenager, especially through the 60s and the 70s? And did your taste transition to other genres as you grew older?
A bit, but primarily I learned to read very young because I went to a Montessori school, which is the type of school that they encourage you to pursue whatever you're interested in at the time. And I was really intrigued by the notion of reading, and it worked very well for me. And then as I grew up, I enjoyed primarily novels. Primarily English novels, by the way, because of my mother. So I've read through many of those. But of course, I also had to read professionally. And as a result of having to read professionally, I developed a talent for speed reading, which still is with me until today. So I can read extremely quickly, at the detriment sometimes of appreciating the beauty of a book, but it still helps me. And the number of 10,000, which is probably a realistic estimate, I really got there because I was able to digest them at a very high rate. So typically I will read a couple of books a week, most of them starting after 11 or so, and then taking whatever, half an hour, 1.5 hours before I go to sleep. And that, of course, is the way to do it. And then on top of that, all these boring official documents also help me at least to upscale my reading proficiency still a bit further.
So a couple of books per week.
Yes.
That's awesome. You have a broad interest in visual arts. Could you comment on your specific preferences over the years and how you believe encouraging children and teenagers to appreciate these forms of art can play a significant role in shaping their lives as adults?
My own preferences have been shaped very much by my own education. My mother, again, was very fond of music, very fond of the theater, less interested in visual art. But I had a couple of very good teachers. And of course, in the Netherlands, we are blessed by the presence of the rich tradition of the 17th century, as it is stored and can be watched and admired in many Dutch museums. So it's almost impossible to live here and not be exposed to great art and very accessible art. And what I have always wanted to encourage was a full and broad exposure of young children to all arts, including the visuals, by school visits, but also by being trained and encouraged to practice art oneself during the period one spends in primary or secondary school. That has worked pretty well, I think, in this country, at the expense, I have to say, of music. Music as a cultural form of expression has not completely disappeared from the school curriculum, but it has been, I think, basically reduced significantly over time, much to my regret. But the visual arts are still there. And again, of course, looking at history, that probably is the one area where the Dutch have a global reputation to defend.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had the chance to visit a couple of museums there.
Good.
Of course, in Amsterdam,
Yeah.
Hague, and the Hague Museum and so on. It's just incredible. I also went to Rembrandt's house. I found it incredible too. So, yeah.
Good. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah. A lot of influence by my wife, by the way. I should give her credit. So let's talk about your school experience. A couple of teachers played a key role in your early years, right?
As I think in everybody's life, you have one or two or maybe three teachers who really leave their mark on your lives. That's why it's such a wonderful profession to be in. And I was lucky to have a very good math teacher in secondary school. Originally, I had a strong preference for the humanities, and I planned to either study law or history. But after this math teacher came into my life, I loved it so much, enjoyed it so much, had an obvious talent for it, that when secondary school was over, I did not have to think long and went for a math degree. And of course, I've considered myself to be a mathematician ever since.
Mm-hmm. As you grew older, you suffered from bullying and isolation in school. One of your friends even stopped hanging out with you because it looked bad for him. How did you overcome such a difficult period?
I think like most people do, and of course I was certainly not the only one. Many people have been forced to survive that kind of regime. I just turned inwards, but my parents helped me enormously by sending me to an English school for a semester when I was 16. And when I had returned from that experience, I had changed. I certainly was much more extrovert than I was before. And I also had something interesting to share and tell to my classmates. So they looked at me also with new eyes and new respect. And from then on, I think my bad years were over. I've never suffered from isolation since I became, I think, pretty good in building and establishing and maintaining relationships with others. But I've always remembered the experience and always, as a result, tried to protect people who suffered through similar bad experiences and who needed some encouragement and support to survive. So I think just for that reason alone, it certainly helped me in a way to be much more tuned into the needs of others and knowing full well how bad you can feel if you have a strong impression that nobody really likes you or cares about you.
Right. So it was a difficult time, but you'll try to extract some positive lessons out of that experience.
Yes, and I think I have.
Mm-hmm. How would you summarize your time at Leiden University? I know it was a particularly busy period for you, not just mathematically and academically, but also with the global events unfolding in the late 1970s, including numerous protests and demonstrations. How did all of this shape your experience there?
I think I was extremely lucky to be there when I was, because it was such an interesting period in many, many ways. For the reasons you just mentioned, the upheaval in politics, the student revolution that spread from France to other parts of the world, Vietnam as another experience, a war that really shaped our perception of the world and our sense of responsibility for it. But I also enjoyed student life and my studies enormously, and basically liked it so much and did pretty well that I at some point had the opportunity to sign up for a graduate student position in Leiden to write a PhD degree in pure mathematics. But as you may remember from reading my book, something extraordinary happened. I was about to be appointed, and then all of a sudden, the then Minister of Education declared a complete and 100% job freeze for all the universities. And so I lost this opportunity. Very, very strangely so, because if I had finished my degree a week later or a week earlier, we probably could have found our way around it, but I didn't. And so basically, I was out there in the cold. And I remember vividly thinking that this probably was some kind of sign of some providential being warning me that was about to make a decision that was not the right one for me. So I took that as a strong hint, and I moved into applied mathematics and studied econometrics, and very soon ran into my future PhD supervisor, Gijs de Leeuwen, and through him into Karel Lenstra, who had very similar interests to mine. And so at the end of this particular period and a fair amount of personal turmoil, I had found the person that I would continue to interact with for decades, and who was my number one collaborator and a cooperator on many, many occasions. Again, very lucky, I would hope, for both of us, certainly for me.
Yeah, and talking about him, on his Subject to episode, your research partner in crime, Karel Lenstra, mentioned that you popped into his office out of the blue one day, marking the beginning of a fruitful friendship. What do you think made your partnership so effective? And do you have any anecdote to share about your experiences together?
Oh, absolutely. Many. But I think primarily we worked so well together because we were sufficiently similar and sufficiently different. I think that is always the secret. Sufficiently similar to understand each other very well. We had the same sense of humor, the same perspective on society at large. There are many things that we agreed on. But we're also very different in that he was, and still is, extremely detailed and meticulous in his thinking, very well informed about the history and origins of whatever we were working on, very well suited to sort out the minuscule details that matter. And I was much sloppier, but I had, I think, a gift to grasp a subject as a whole, to figure out how to tell a particular story, to how to develop and convincingly present a particular argument. So when we collaborated, as we did, again, many, many years, I think we jointly wrote almost 200 papers. I always produced the first draft quite quickly, but the main line of the argument was there. And then Karel took it and transformed it into a serious publication. And so we had a wonderful time together. And traveled a lot together and shared the circumstances, some of which were pretty primitive, but always enjoyable in his company. And I will tell you one anecdote that sums up, I think, also his sense of humor. We at some point had to share a hotel room, cost-wise, because our budgets were always rather low. And so we had this hotel room with a pretty small double bed that we also would have to share. And so Karel looked at it and said, I think the logical optimum would be for each of us to take a diagonal, but they intersect in such an awkward region, so maybe that's not a good idea. So anyhow, we survived that night. We survived the many, many years. I still see him very regularly. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of our interaction just a few months ago, and in February, and we have decided to now repeat that every year, so that at least we have an annual get-together. And he is in many ways an extraordinary man, coming from an extraordinary family. Of course, you probably know that all of his brothers are successful mathematicians, all in a way excelling in their own domain of specialization. That's certainly true for Karel, and he, at the end of his career, he also had an interest in and a gift for educational and educational politics. So he also contributed significantly to that area, but by and large, I think he will be remembered for his extremely productive years as a researcher. And again, many of his earlier articles were ones that we jointly worked on.
Yes, now I can understand why you guys make a perfect match and how you really appreciate his friendship, company, and how you guys enjoyed working together. That's very inspiring. Young Karel also mentioned that you were introduced to the groundbreaking work by Cook and Karp via Mike Florian, who, by the way, was also a subjective guest. Mike remembers very fondly of the moments he experienced with both of you, especially your visit to Montreal.
Yes.
What are your memories from these events?
Well, my dominating memory is that I've never been as cold as I was in my life as I was in Montreal. We were there in January. Of course, Canadian winters were and are severe. The very first thing I did is I bought a serious winter coat. We really needed it. And I can best illustrate the climate in Montreal by telling you how we walked from the hotel that we stayed in to the university every day through a park. And I said to young Karel, look, this park, how nicely lit it is. There were these low knee-high lanterns that just were put there to illuminate the path that we had to take. And so we did that, going back and forth until in the end of our stay, the spring arrived and the snow started to melt. And these small lamps turned out to be 6 feet high street lamps, but the lower parts of which had been completely covered by snow. So the winters were just amazing. And Mike Florian very kindly had organized this for us and was an extremely good host. And so we are, I think, still grateful. This was our first big international experience. First of the many that we're still following, but in a way, one of the most memorable ones. I'm happy that you talked to him.
Yes.
And I hope he's doing well.
Yes, he's 85, doing well. Such a nice person.
Absolutely.
I had a wonderful time interviewing him. Yes.
I'm sure you did.
Yes. What were the main contributions of your PhD work? Please don't refrain yourself from being technical.
I'll try to be at least accessible in what I say to those of your listeners or readers who don't know this area so well. But I think the summary is probably as useful as any. We were once again rather lucky because Michael Florian had introduced us to Cook and Karp's work. And I think the one thing that we both did is we immediately realized its potential in a very big area like machine scheduling that had the problem classification variation of the one originally found in the book by Conway, Maxwell, and Miller, our first serious book, the first serious book on this particular area. And of course, the computational complexity theory, as we guessed, hoped, and finally saw, was the perfect tool to structure this huge domain with its thousands of problem types and draw the boundary between easy and hard. Easy being polynomially solvable and hard being NP complete. And we had no clue when we started how precise the tool was, but very quickly we realized that that boundary could be drawn very, very detailedly, and we went on and did it. And not all the problems that we looked at were classifiable that easily. Several of them escaped us for almost a decade, but I think at the end of the day, it was a lot of fun. And Gene Lawler, who was with us, was a fantastic person to work with. He, of course, was extremely gifted in detecting clever proofs for NP completeness, but he, I think, enjoyed developing and discovering polynomial time algorithms even more. So we were both working on different sides of this particular barrier. And I think at the end of the day, managed to arrive at a fairly complete map of the domain. And so we then agreed and were determined to put all of this in the final and definite textbook on this area. We started working on it when we were in Berkeley. Gene invited us to Berkeley for 5 successive years. Enjoyed the process, but made very slow progress because when we were working on these chapters, we were distracted into new ideas or new research. So we never finished the book, not in that period, not in those summers, but not even after those summers until quite recently. Karel and I said to each other, we just need to wind up this huge project at some point. We had by then more collaborators, other co-authors. And so Karel, again, as he would and does, put in the finishing touch, designed some of the artwork, put everything on internet. And basically that's where it sits, hoping perhaps one day for a new author to pick it up and finalize it completely, but happy at the same time that this great souvenir of our early days is around.
I love that you mentioned that as a souvenir. It's a very appropriate term, I would say. You guys did fantastic work, very influential. At the same time, you took advantage of the low-hanging fruits, correct?
Yes, that is true. And that is why we were lucky. And I think people who had a similar experience will recognize what I say. Sometimes there are breakthroughs, new paradigms, if you will, for operations research or for indeed any other science. And all of a sudden, that opens up a huge collection of new problems and questions, all of which are refinements of the big ones that have been asked, that have been answered by the person creating the breakthrough. And that was certainly true in our case. So again, we were lucky that Dick Karp and Stephen Cook had the genius to perceive that this was interesting and would really help understanding how the world of combinatorial optimization fits together. But I think we and many others took it from there. Gary and Johnson wrote their book, which of course was the first wonderful example of how much detail you can essentially obtain. And the tool itself has been of lasting significance. It's still part of the toolkit of combinatorial optimization, now fully accepted, in spite of that one open PSMP question that still haunts us and that I'm beginning to believe I will not see resolved in my lifetime.
Yes. After you finished your PhD in 1977, you were appointed to a chair at Erasmus University at the Econometric Institute.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that you hesitated for a long time to apply, but in the end, it turned out to be great in your career, right?
Yes. It worked very well for two reasons. First of all, I was very welcome there, and I was welcome in a great research environment. The Econometric Institute was in those days already famously influential. The Dutch preferred, for reasons that are primarily historical, to put operations research in that particular location, viewing it as the sort of business side of econometrics. The Dutch translation is almost literally business econometrics. You had general econometrics, which built models for economies as a whole, macroeconomic models. And then, of course, there is in Dutch bedrijfseconomie, business economics, and the business econometric side was what OR was supposed to be. And all of that was due to a remarkable person by the name of Henry Theil, who was the founder of the Institute. Very, very prolific author, very smart man, also extremely ambitious, who at some point realized that he could draw operations research into his camp and have it support basically the reputation of the Institute. So that happened, and it worked extremely well, I think, for both sides. And when I got there, I was fresh, I had ideas, I was a productive researcher, I fitted in very, very nicely. And I also found a number of very, very smart PhD students who worked with me, who got their PhD. Recently, they presented me with the family tree that I have spurned, which is by now pretty big. I have great grandchildren in this academic family tree, where, as you know, your father basically is your PhD supervisor, and your children are the persons that you supervise yourself. I have great grandchildren by now. In fact, one of my great grandchildren is now a full professor in Rotterdam. So the tree will grow and grow and grow. They were very happy, the university that is, to support my research. They funded some of the students that needed to be funded. They funded my travel quite generously. It couldn't have been better. But then, of course, my life really changed because they asked me to be the rector of the university. And I was happy to do that simply for a sense of adventure. But I realized that it would be hard to maintain my research involvement. I managed to do it more or less when I was the rector of the university, but when I moved into a very different environment afterwards, as you already briefly mentioned, when I became the president of the Federation of Employers, in spite of what my grandmother might have thought, I realized that my research days were probably over, because whatever you can say about research in mathematics, the one thing that it needs is full-time involvement. You cannot just do that on a 1 hour a day, 1 hour a week basis. And that was about all I had. So realistically, I had to step out, and I did after about 20 years in a domain that I enjoyed enormously, that I really discovered and explored together with young Karel, where I had fantastic colleagues, where I was witness of a great many fantastic presentations, witnessed a number of very interesting breakthroughs and developments. So with very fond memories, at the same time, I have to acknowledge that my active involvement as a researcher just could not be combined with the roles that I was destined to play from age 40 onwards.
Right. We're going to talk about that later. Around that period, in the late 70s, you experienced several dramatic events: the loss of your mother, the end of your first marriage, a serious health issue, and so on. Mm-hmm. How much did all of this influence you at the time and in the years that followed?
Well, it was very stressful, and especially the combination was very stressful. And I think, again, people who have been through similar experiences will recognize that you can cope with only so much of setback in your life at any single point in time. And maybe there are sort of three categories of setbacks. Let's say your job and your financial situation, your health, and your love life. And so if one out of these three is suffering, you can typically manage it. If 2 out of 3 are suffering, then you have a real problem. And if 3 are sort of suffering, then you have a real issue. And in my case, I was sort of between 2 and 3. And I suffered very badly. I had some terribly difficult years. I had a great deal of physical pain. And it left me with a lot of nervousness and anxiety that got resolved in due course when I remarried, and now am part of a wonderful family. So all of these things, fortunately, more often just come and go. But once again, as in the case of my secondary school experience, I felt and still feel a great deal of sympathy for people who all of a sudden find themselves confronted with serious physical and mental challenges. And I've always made an effort to be as helpful as I could.
I see. I mean, I can only imagine how you should have suffered at that time. But again, somehow you came out stronger, maybe, after facing all of that. And
yes,
you learn how to
It's
cope.
a famous quote from a German philosopher, Nietzsche: "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger."
Yeah.
And that, I think, applies very much to this situation. And again, people who have survived these periods will recognize that if you indeed do survive, you retain control, you are on top of what needs to be done, then that becomes a benefit for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. You have a wonderful career in various aspects, and many people might not be aware of some of the difficult period you had to, go through at secondary school, then later on, and how that shaped you later and how that made you who you are is also remarkable based on what you have experienced. You spent a good amount of time as a visiting professor at MIT and Berkeley. Could you share some memories from those visits from both scientific and personal perspectives?
Scientifically, I had permission at some point from my university in the Netherlands, University of Rotterdam, to take up a sabbatical. And so I was happy to visit first MIT. Tom McNanty was the dean at the time and a very good host. Jim Orlin was also one of my colleagues when I visited there. He was a very nice, very modest, and a somewhat shy person, but very friendly and hospitable. He let me have his car, since he just bought a new one. And there I remember very distinctly that this was the only car I've ever driven in that used more oil than gasoline, because it was not in great shape. And so we went to the supermarket and bought a rack of tins of very cheap oil and threw in an entire tin every 10 kilometers or so when we drove around the northeastern part of the US, searching for the wonderful colors of autumn that I talked about earlier that are now visible in Amsterdam. And so personally, it was a great time. My wife went along. We had a very young son. And the department at MIT, of course, was exemplary, very, very good, and closely positioned to the Department of Economics at MIT, which is even more surprisingly very, very good. It doesn't seem to fit in this super technology environment as naturally as many other things did, but it was there, and Paul Samuelson was still the lead economist there. You could not have wished for a better one. So MIT, great combination of academic and commercial quality. Almost every professor there was encouraged to pursue commercial pursuits and did so, up to and including those in the OR department. And I just was super happy to work with them, take classes. And what I especially learned during that period was a lot about the theory and practice of negotiation. There was the famous Harvard negotiation project just underway. Max Bazerman was professor at MIT who pursued that domain. I attended his class. I took this subject with me back to Rotterdam and started a class in negotiation myself. Lots of variations in teaching that particular subject. I took it with me to Amsterdam. I'm still actively involved in it to this very day. So that was a very fortunate part of my visit to MIT. On to Berkeley when the weather turned against us. The winters in Boston can also be very cold. But of course, California has had, maybe still has to some extent, certainly had perfect weather. And that is where I set up business again with G. Lawler. Dorit Hochbaum was one of my colleagues there. I'm not sure what happened to her. I hope she's still around. I see you nodding. That's encouraging. She was a very good and clever colleague. I collaborated with Dick Karp. That was a particular source of pleasure. We wrote a short paper together. I just enjoyed working with him enormously. And of course, Berkeley is probably one of the most beautiful campuses in the world, and an extremely good university with lots of things going on culturally and academically. So that year, I think, was also one of the great pleasures of my life.
Uh-huh. It's fascinating to learn that during your time at MIT, one of the things that really stood with you was the negotiation aspect.
Yes.
I mean, from an academic perspective, but then you found a way to put that in practice, right? And it's
Absolutely.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Absolutely. And then the ideas from that year, the techniques, if you will, that I learned and since then taught many others have really helped me enormously. There's some good basic insights in negotiation that you have to keep in mind wherever you negotiate, and all of us are doing it all the time.
Uh-huh. Would you highlight your main research activities and contributions at Erasmus University?
Basically, I pursued combinatorial optimization, scheduling problems, and ramifications of that area, also the probabilistic side of it, where you get into probability theory by assuming probability distributions on the problem parameters and see where it gets you. very hard mathematics, but I had a very good collaborator called Hans Frank, who was extremely good in probability theory. So he really helped me, and we did some very nice work together. One of the great pleasures I had in those days was to work with Mordecai, or Matti as he called himself, Heimovich. We together wrote a paper on capacitated routing problems that won an award. It's probably the best paper I've ever done. And I could do it because he was so fantastically good. So we looked at these capacitated routing problems and got much further than I thought we would ever be able to do in analyzing them from various perspectives. And again, he was super, super good. And then one day we were halfway through our next paper and he called me and said that he'd thought about it, but decided to become a rabbi.
Wow.
He left mathematics. And he became a full-time religious person, a rabbi in Israel, in a very conservative Orthodox part of the Jewish religion. I just couldn't believe it. He was so enormously good at what he did, but he was quite serious about it and withdrew from mathematics. He created and carried out one of the first probabilistic analyses of the simplex method. Very, very clever work. But that was never published because he was just not happy about it, and then he became a rabbi. So that document, the paper that is still being referred to, is only available as a technical report from the University of Chicago. Very, very clever guy, wonderful to work with. And then I stumbled across and started a new research area, global optimization. Very natural question being, how can you detect global optima? Because the tools that we have typically, at least in continuous optimization, don't allow us to do that. They just help you find a local optimum, but not necessarily a global one. There are all sorts of techniques that you can use. The one that I liked best was the sampling technique. You sample a lot of points and you make probability statements about how likely it is that you have now found a truly global optimum. It turns out that you can do that. That, I think, again, was very, very interesting because I had a few wonderful students. And again, we published a few papers in mathematical programming, long papers, 30 pages each, which I think, again, are among the best ones I ever did. And I really enjoyed it. I'm still in touch with two of the students I worked with at the time. And again, we all look back on this as a very happy period.
Yeah. You seem to be an incredibly talented researcher. I wonder what would have happened if you had stayed longer doing research.
We'll never know. But again, I thought about it. And of course, it was a hard decision to make, to turn to that job with the Employers Federation. But at the same time, I realized that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so many students have asked me for career advice and how do you pursue the kind of career that I've had, which is at least extremely varied and very much a career that has kept me alive and kicking through all those changes. And the best thing that I was able to tell them is that whenever you have such an opportunity, which many of you will, at some time in your life, whenever something happens to you in terms of an option that you had no hope or idea that you could ever possibly exercise, then don't hesitate too long. Just do it. With a little bit of luck, you'll be successful and your life will be enriched. And if you have a little bit of bad luck, you can always return to where you came from and pick up where you left it. So you have little to lose and a lot to gain. And that's what I did a number of times.
Yeah, it's very valuable advice. Alexander, in 1986, at the age of 36, as you already mentioned, you became rector of Erasmus University. Do you feel you were fully prepared for that role at that time, or do you think you may have skipped some important steps along the way?
I'm sure I missed out on, let's say, managerial experience because I had none. And all of a sudden, I had to co-manage a pretty large organization. So I had no managerial experience whatsoever. And I had to learn basically on the job. But I did. And maybe at the end of the day, that is an option that many people would have. But of course, in universities, people typically rather dislike administrative work and administrative responsibility. When they do it because they have to, and then they return to their research and teaching with a sigh of relief. And to some extent, I had doubts about this particular transition, but it turned out it worked rather well. And just as I was considering to go back into research, which I always also was looking forward to, this follow-up offer to be the president of the Employers Federation came along, and that was one of the most visible jobs in the country. And again, I thought, when you think about it, you can think of many reasons not to do it, but you can also trust the people nominating you, that they maybe see opportunities in you that you don't even are aware of yourself. And why don't you trust their judgment and give it a try? And once again, if everything fails, you can always go back to the university or teach mathematics in some school, you'll be fine. And I basically think that is the right attitude. Sometimes things happen to you where you have no reason at all to expect them, and see them as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for basic change, and take a deep breath and go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Before I talk about that, as soon as you finish your term as rector of Erasmus University, you found yourself walking the streets of Philadelphia for a year.
Yes.
How did that opportunity come about, and what was your experience like living in the US during that time?
The opportunity came about because I had met Marshall Fisher and formed a friendship with him. And when he heard that I was entitled to a sabbatical, he immediately invited me to come to the Wharton School, where he was teaching and redoing research, and enabled me to basically sit on a very interesting special chair that had been created by the Anheuser-Busch Foundation for Russell Ackoff. And Russell Ackoff was one of the grand old men of operations research. So to essentially step in his footsteps was a big honor. And I was very happy to do it, and happy I did it. So we loved the university. The Wharton School, of course, was a very famous and well-endowed school with great opportunities to grow and learn, and also a very generous school. One of the things I remember visibly is that when I got there as a visiting professor, they said, well, we have a rule here, or a facility here. We give you $10,000 budget, which you can expend on everything but yourself. So you can pay for a computer, you can pay for a book, you can pay for a research assistant, you can pay for travel, but you don't put it in your own pocket. And that'll be it. Do I have to submit evidence that I did what I should do? No, they just trusted me. And that I liked enormously. Just the trustful part was so nice. I come from a country that has basically created bureaucratic mechanisms to check everything twice or three times. And there are probably good reasons for it, but there they were so generous, they just felt I probably would spend it wisely, and I think I did. So it was a great environment, a great school, great colleagues. In fact, I was tempted to think about staying there, which they offered as an option. But then, of course, the job offer from the Netherlands came around, and I went back.
Yes. So after returning from the US, you were appointed in 1991 as chairman of the Association of Dutch Enterprises, known as VNO, which represented the interests of the Dutch business community. This was certainly a shift in your professional career, as you already mentioned. How would you summarize your term in such a distinguished position?
Again, I was an amateur in many ways, and a totally unknown person. Typically, people who got appointed to that job had a history in the public domain or were visible representatives in a somewhat smaller setting. But I was none of these. I was just an academic. They had found, and for some strange reason, deemed to be suitable for the job. And as much as I wondered about their judgment, again, as I said just now, I thought I might as well take the chance and see what happened. And so I did. And I have to say, first of all, they were very generous and friendly and hospitable. But I suppose I had some talent for this kind of job too. Just basically practicing my newly found negotiation skills and essentially creating a good personal relationship with the other players in this particular domain. There was of course, the number one party I worked with were the Dutch trade unions, very strong tradition, very well organized, and the president there, my primary opponent, if you will, at the end of the day became a very good friend. We worked together on many occasions. Of course, we had our ritual debates, but we knew precisely what each of us could and could not get away with. And so on many occasions, we managed to find a compromise solution to the problems facing the country. And I think at the end of the day, also the Netherlands benefited from that kind of collaboration and benefits from that kind of political economic climate, because there is much less tension between employers and workers in the Dutch economy than there is elsewhere, and the way in which they can jointly express support for Dutch government policies that benefit the economy as a whole, I think has produced a climate that has worked out well for the country. So I was lucky to get the opportunity, maybe also a bit lucky in being able to do well, but at the end of the day, I managed to organize a merger between the two leading federations at the time, one Christian and one non-Christian. Clearly, they had already a strong collaboration, but there were lots of inefficiencies that could be traced back to the duplication of work and effort that was seemingly inevitable. But I worked with my counterpart at the Christian Federation, and together we managed to convince our members that it would be much smarter to join forces. And we did, and I have to say it's one of the few mergers that I've observed, I've been part of, that has been a successful by every possible standard. Many of these mergers don't work out so well. They're disappointing and don't deliver as much as people thought they would. But in this particular case, it's been an enormous success, and there is now a very stable climate with just one big party representing employers at large. So that was a happy end.
Wow. To take part in such a relevant process, I'm sure you benefited a lot from your negotiation skills that you have acquired at MIT and then as a rector. So this is just amazing. In 1995, you became a member of the executive board of the ING Group, which stands for International Netherlands Group. I first heard about ING when I saw its logo on the Renault Formula One team's car. I'm a fan of Formula One. How did this happen, and what do you learn from this experience in the private sector?
Well, after I had served my term, or 2 terms actually, as a president of the Employers Federation, I was much in demand. I had all sorts of offers from the private sector. But again, I realized that I had limited, in fact, no experience whatsoever in any of them. So I was hesitant to choose. But then I got the job offer from ING, and there I was lucky once again because they had just merged. They were a result of a merger between a bank and an insurance company, and we're trying to exploit a joint perspective. And I thought that with a little bit of work, I should be able to be as informed about banks as most insurers would be, and vice versa. So the need for a deep competence was eliminated by the very fact that a recent merger had occurred between these two not necessarily similar sectors. So I did it, and again, I had 10 very interesting years. For the first time in my life, having an executive responsibility for a complex and very big business. ING in those days employed 125,000 people worldwide, was active in about 70 countries. At some point, I was responsible for the Asian insurance business. I traveled, I got to learn several of these countries pretty well. They were just a major player in every possible ways with some very strong brands. And the time that I spent there was a time of growth and expansion. Very good years for business. And when business does well, banks do enormously well because they can be boosted by a good environment and also suffer quite badly from a bad environment. But in my years, the environments were good. So very productive and profitable years. And of course, I now learned from the inside how much it takes in terms of flexibility and adaptability for big businesses in this particular domain to survive and do well. And I was very happy to be part of that process.
Mm-hmm. Was it more stressful than VNO?
No, because it was, I think, similar, but in a different sense. In VNO, the work that I did, at the end of the day, its success was determined by a political response, and that adds a layer of anxiety. By VNO, after VNO at ING, success was dependent on your ability to assess risks in the marketplace. And at least there is more science to it than in politics, but at the same time, the amount of money involved is so huge that a small mistake you make can be extremely costly.
Right.
So that compensates, if you will, mm-hmm. for the well-structuredness of the area. They both offer challenges, but again, I felt very privileged to be part of both of them.
Uh-huh. As you were about to leave your position at ING, you had an accident in India during your farewell trip through Asia. Could you share more details about it, and how long did it take for you to fully recover from the incident?
Oh, that was an very embarrassing and stupid thing that happened to me. I had my farewell tour. I was about to leave ING and join the Social Economic Council. And when I arrived in India, they asked me to perform a small ceremonial role in a hockey tournament in which business teams competed against each other. And so I said, of course, and we went to the hockey field. The hockey field was not real grass, but artificial, well, not even grass, basically concrete, on which they had put green felt, so that it at least looked green, and then turned it to and maintain it at a high degree of wetness, just spraying water over it all the time. And so it was extremely slippery. And on top of everything else, I was also wearing shoes with leather soles. So when I had to do what I had to do, which is just push the ball in the direction of the goal of the opponents of the ING team, I just slipped up and I landed on my back with such a resounding crack that I felt I even heard something break. And indeed, something had broken. So I had broken my thigh and my shoulder in one fall, also a bad sign. I had to wait about 2 hours until the drivers of the local ambulance had finished their lunch, and then they took me to a local hospital in Bangalore, fortunately managed by a very good orthopedic surgeon trained in the US. And so he went to work and essentially put me together again. And it took about 6 months for me to recover, but I was happy to recover. And in fact, I haven't suffered any nasty after effects. So it was a very strange experience. And again, a pretty stupid accident. I lost my taste as a result of the surgery they did, probably because they gave me more anesthetics than I really needed. So for 3 weeks, I did not taste anything at all. It's very hard to eat. It's food that you swallow tastes like newspaper, basically. So not a pleasant recovery, but at the end of the day, an appropriate ending may be to a very interesting period. And I moved on to the Social Economic Council with very good memories of my time in the banking industry, financial industry.
Right. Yeah, incidentally, I have a relative in Bangalore who's an orthopedist.
Okay. It's an important specialization. I was lucky to have a good one.
Yeah. After about a decade at ING, you were named chairman of the Social and Economic Council, or SER, in 2006. And you held that position until 2012. According to Wikipedia, in the 3 years that followed, the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant named you the most influential person in the Netherlands, which is quite astonishing. Could you please explain how SER works and why your role there was considered so impactful for the country?
The Social Economic Council is very much a Dutch invention after the war. And it's based on the idea that if employers and trade unions can agree on important social economic legislation, then the government has a lot to win and not much to lose by following up on that advice, because the fact that there is this broad support for it almost ensures that the policy will be successful when implemented. And so, as a chairman of such an advisory board, you are part of, I think, all the major political debates in the country. And since I also had a big portfolio of more or less honorary functions outside this domain, I was present and sitting at the table on many important debates took place, and was viewed by the Volkskrant, the Dutch newspaper, as an influential participant, which I suppose in a way I was. But that, of course, was very much part of the job. It is not so much my personal competence that is being celebrated there, but just the practical and the professional relevance of the job itself. So not surprisingly, perhaps, I was nominated and appointed or selected as the most influential person in the Dutch political and economic system for 3 successive years. But when I left this job, that particular classification, of course, left me. Again, it is, of course, interesting to have that experience, and in a way fun, because you get invited to all the right parties. But it was very much linked to the job. And when I left the job, the whole classification left me, and I just enjoyed having the experience and accepted fully that it was a thing of the past.
Right. Again, in terms of stress and negotiation, how was it?
Yes, that is very much so. The SER is really a negotiation machine. So it brings the parties together that have no natural inclination to agree with each other, but who both know that there's a lot for them to gain if they manage to do it. And so your role as a chairman, as one of the official independent members of that body, is to create the conditions for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it requires a lot of patience, skills.
Yes.
Yeah, very complicated.
Patience is maybe the number one skill you have to exercise.
Yeah.
But the Netherlands, again, is a country that has a climate very conducive to this kind of intervention. So basically, you are part of a culture that focuses on compromise and that encourages people to empathize and to see the world through each other's eyes. And that has produced many very good outcomes, also a few of which I was part of.
Mm-hmm. In 2015, you became a member of the Senate in the Netherlands, which is something almost unheard of for a person with a background in mathematical optimization. As a politician, what were your main activities, and what would you say is your legacy?
Well, the Dutch Senate has a role that is significant, but not as hugely significant as the US Senate. The system is really different. What is similar is that it's a fairly small group of people with relatively much experience in private or public domains. So I fitted that profile. And what they basically do is they review legislation that has passed the second chamber, which does most of the work, and see if there is anything worth observing or perhaps changing or adapting in the light of the experience they jointly offer. And as such, I had an interesting portfolio. I was the spokesperson on finance and education, 2 big areas, and also on labor law. And perhaps my finest hour was when I struggled to get a certain labor law defeated. And although I did not quite do it, I was well rewarded by the fact that half a year after the law had passed, the minister in question had to return to Parliament and admit that it wasn't working for precisely the reasons I had warned him about. So at least I got some credit for that. And I think I was part of the democratic process, which of course is vulnerable, as we all know, but which I think at the end of the day I learned to appreciate and found to be in pretty healthy shape. So it was encouraging to me to be part of that system, and I was very much impressed by the dedication and the professional quality of many of the people that I work with.
Mm-hmm. One of the things politics and optimization have in common is the process of decision making. How can you bring both into the same conversation? Perhaps this could be achieved by creating a Ministry of Operations Research.
Now I have to disappoint you. I, of course, had a very different background, as you already mentioned, from most of my colleagues. And that served me well whenever the debate turned to the, let's call it the technological side of industrial policy, for instance. I had an edge on all of them. But the direct application of the mathematics of optimization in politics are rare, to say almost non-existent. And at the same time, I have never regretted my background, primarily because being a mathematician gives you an ability, provides you with an ability to keep track of complicated arguments and reasonings. It allows you to digress and revisit arguments and not forget the trace of your analysis, and to keep you on track towards the ultimate goal of resolution. So the world of mathematics, I think, has taught me a lot of intellectual skills that, although I did not apply them directly, and it's certainly true for pure mathematics, served me as a general cognitive training ground. And from that perspective, I think my background was exceptionally appropriate.
Right. I mean, I wish we could have the chance to put OR as an option, at least for decision making when it comes to political environment. Who knows, in the future, our community can find a way to do so.
I hope so.
Yes. Out of all the roles you have held in your life, which one was the most challenging and why?
They each, to be frank, had their own challenging features. Maybe the very first job that was visible and demanding, the rectorate of the university, in a way was the hardest, because I was really new to the world of administrative decision-making and policy debates. And so I had to learn on the spot to do it and do well. So that, I think, is probably number one. And number two is probably the job that I had at the Social Economic Council, because during certain periods, the climate that I just praised, the climate of compromise and collaboration, soured significantly, and former friends and colleagues became not so much enemies, but people who realized that there was more that separated them than that bound them. And so that was also hard. When you are chairman of what is essentially a machine for producing compromise, and a very good one at that, and you all of a sudden discover that interest in compromise as such is declining, then it's hard and demanding to pull through. But again, you know, they have the nice Dutch expression. I'm not sure if it's one in English too, so perhaps you will recognize it. But in the Netherlands, they have the expression, you are what they call a Sunday's child, a child born on Sunday. And it means that you're lucky. For some reason, you have the wind in your back. You can stumble, but you won't fall. You can just proceed through your life and enjoy the blessings of good fortune. And I think I'm in that category. I was really lucky. Of course, I have worked extremely hard, and it's certainly true. I dedicated whatever I had to the goals that my various jobs demanded from me, and with some success. But by and large, I also think I should have the humility to recognize the good luck that has been an instrumental part of that success story.
Yes, I can understand. You have been involved in so many roles, but you excelled in literally all of them. And this is just astonishing. Very inspiring too. Alexander, do you have any regrets?
Strangely enough, not so much a regret, but an afterthought that my life would have been so completely different if that amazing incident had not occurred that robbed me of our job at the Leiden Mathematical Institute. And it was just a very, very peculiar thing to happen. And under normal circumstances, my life would have been very, very different from the one that I had. Certainly not necessarily better, but also not necessarily worse. And I feel I probably would have been a decent pure mathematician, maybe with a decent university career or with a good career inspiring young people to like mathematics, which is something I love to do. But somehow or other, Providence willed otherwise. And so I ended up where I am. And again, I've been served very well by circumstances, and I'm truly grateful to the many people that I met and befriended on my way, many of whom are part of the community that you're also part of. And I have to say that of all the larger beings, larger wholes that I've been part of, the professional group of mathematicians that I was part of, the community of math researchers that I was part of, have stayed with me as one where very rarely, I think, ultimately the merits prevail. It's a true meritocracy. You are judged not for where you come from or for who you are, let alone for who your parents were. You are judged by what you contribute to the profession. And that is evaluated fairly, and the outcome of that evaluation is quite openly shared with you. It shows up in what happens to you. It shows up in you having possibilities to travel, to speak at conferences, to become editor of boards of important professional journals. There is a very, very well-defined but fair and merit-based pecking order. And to be part of such a community where you can really excel at whatever you're good at and be appreciated for it, that I think was one of the greatest privileges that I've had.
Wow. Alexander, you were currently a distinguished professor at the University of Amsterdam and still seem quite active these days. What are your plans for the future? Is there any chance you'll be doing more research?
Not in mathematics. That is something you cannot afford to let drop and then pick up again. You need to be fully involved. I'm still involved in advisory jobs. Also, a couple of them are quite demanding and complex. But at the same time, and I hope to pursue them for a number of more years, but I also have to be realistic. I turned 75 a few days ago. And so I know full well that at some point there is, if not spoken, the unspoken hope that younger talents will take over, and that you should be aware of what your natural role is for the remaining years of your life, which is to be on the sidelines, contribute where you can, support where you can, but not expect to play a leading or very visible role. And I'm happy to do that. I've had a great saying in the back of my mind during the last years: never overstay your welcome. And I think that's very good advice. That's very good advice. Get out while the going is good, and transfer what you know and have learned to a next generation, and help them as much as you can, giving them the credit rather than taking it yourself. So that's what I'm doing. I'm also a very proud grandfather of 5 grandchildren. I'm in the house of my daughter right now, about to have dinner with her and say goodnight to my grandchild. That probably is an enormous blessing as well. So by and large, I find myself extremely grateful, well aware of my privileges, and happy to have this conversation with you, where you represent a generation that hopefully will have similar opportunities going forward.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. The role that you are currently involved with, it's certainly very important. You are, providing support to many people, and sometimes youngsters and some people from my own generation lack this type of things. And when you have the opportunity to learn with people like you, it's just a blessing. And I know that you already gave some very nice advice, but do you have any final messages or thoughts for our young audience?
First of all, I encourage them to take risks. As I already said, 1 or 2 or 3 times in your life, you can do something extraordinary that you never anticipated doing. But that is risky because you're not quite sure that you're up to it. And so I encourage everybody with the talents that I'm sure are shared widely in our community to do as I did and run that risk and see what happens. And I think the second great message that I derive from my own career is that talents are a gift that you have, but they also entail a responsibility. And that responsibility extends widely. It extends to making sure you leave the world a better place, which you can do in many ways. Small scale by being a good father, a good husband, a good teacher, a good advisor, or much more broadly by being a good politician, a good citizen of the nation or the world, each unto his own, but we all have these opportunities. And as we are blessed having the talents, I think the responsibility that comes with it have to be taken very seriously too.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Thanks a lot for sharing. I also encourage my own students to take risks, and sometimes one has to have a lot of courage to do so. And but with some encouragement and support, that becomes more feasible. So before we conclude our conversation, Alexander, I must say that I first heard about your story through my academic grandfather, Nelson Maculan, who's your friend, and he asked me to say hi to you, and
say hi to him. Wonderful man.
Yes, and he also remembers very fondly about your visit to Rio, right, when you organized at school together in the 80s.
Yes.
Right, on combinatorial optimization.
Yes.
So Alexander, it was a fantastic experience to have this conversation with you.
My pleasure.
So grateful. I'm so grateful. I mean, it has been just wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Good luck to you and to your colleagues. And if there is any offshoot or outcome that you can share with me, of course, I'll be interested to see it.
Absolutely. Alexander, I wish to meet you in person in one of these days. You are, of course, welcome to visit Brazil again. We'll be very happy to host you. And take you around. Once again, thanks a lot. Take care of your health, and all the best. Ciao. Bye.
Thank you so much, and say goodbye and hello to my good friends in Brazil.
Absolutely. Bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye, Jan.